All right, welcome back, everyone. Um, we have one more presentation during this session, and if I'm not sure who's going to be sharing their screen for that presentation, but feel free to go ahead and share now. All right, Katerina's. Okay, so next up we have my favorite presentation title of the forum, Three's Company, Sharing a Unified ArchivesSpace Instance. Your presenters today are Julia Corrice, Elizabeth Parker, and Katerina Dimitriadou-Shuster from Cornell University Library. Cornell University Library, CUL, contains 3 separate archival repositories: the Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections, RMC, and the Kheel Center for Labor Management Documentation and Archives, located in Ithaca, New York, and the Weill Cornell Medical Center Archives, located in New York City. In January 2019, RMC implemented ArchivesSpace as their content management system. The Kheel Center and Weill are both currently in process of migrating into CUL's ArchivesSpace instance. This presentation will discuss technical considerations of preparing for migration into an instance already set up for the needs of another repository, training for staff and archivists in geographically dispersed locations and with differing workflows, and issues of shared governance and documentation among all participating repositories. Thank you so much for presenting, everyone, and I'll turn things over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to introduce ourselves one more time after Jessica's introduction. So I am Katerina Dimitriadou-Shuster, Assistant Director for Technical Services at Rare and Manuscript Collections, short for RMC.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Parker. I am the Technical Services Archivist for the Kheel Center for Labor Management Documentation and Archives at Cornell University's ILR School.
And I'm Julia Corrice. I'm the Metadata Operations Librarian in Library Technical Services for Cornell University Library.
So we'd like to start with a quick description of the various repositories that will be mentioned in this presentation. Within the Cornell University Library system, there are several units that hold special collections, not all of them having a presence in ASpace. Rare and Manuscript Collections, or RMC, is located in Ithaca, New York. It is the largest repository of archival collection and the seat of university archives, which has the lion's share of incoming material. Also, large archival collections are held at the Kheel Center for Labor Management Documentation and Archives, or Kheel, located also in Ithaca, New York, and Weill Cornell Medical Library Archives, which is located in New York City. These 2 institutions are currently in the process of joining ASpace with an incremental approach in the case of Weill, and a more comprehensive one for Cornell. For Kheel. Kroc Library Asia Collections and Man Library Special Collections also hold special collection materials. There is an ASpace repository for Kroc Asia, but without a repository administrator, it remains inactive for the time being. So for full disclosure, I joined RMC 2 months after the initial launch of ASpace, which was in January 2019. So I won't be talking much about the details on working towards that initial integration. I will mostly focus on the documentation generated during the process and as part of using ASpace in the following years. For the initial load of historical data, bibliographic holdings and item records were exported from Voyager. Holding and item records were transformed into spreadsheets and then distributed to staff for data cleanup, while bibliographic MARC records were transformed to MARC XML for batch ingest. Most of the working files of this whole process were kept in box. They include templates, data models, load reports, checklists, meeting notes, to-do lists, and research files for all aspects of the process. Our workflows and procedures were recorded in Confluence. And the goal is that they are updated periodically as things evolve. For example, much of the original documentation and step-by-step instructions were written for mapping between ASpace and Voyager, all of which is now obsolete since in 2021, there was a folio implementation, so we don't use Voyager anymore. As part of the sharing process and training for both the RMC technical services staff who were part of the implementation project and the rest of RMC, there were several regular all-staff presentations, trainings and updates, and especially as the implementation approached and for several months after that, there were several troubleshooting workshops and countless conversations, and staff was finding their way around ASpace. The main shared document where ASpace specific workflows and step-by-steps are recorded in the ASpace handbook, which is a document that is also shared with Kheel. And once again, this document is expected to be periodically reviewed and updated as things change. As part of the folio implementation, which again lasted for several years in its preparation, updates to the online catalog was paused in June 2020, and that lasted several months due to staff issues. This created a large backlog of unpublished changes. Everyone was asked to keep track of major areas of changes, especially permanent ones such as box deletions, for cross-checking after regular updates were resumed. This was followed by intense testing, or practically all operations, and troubleshooting where things didn't go as expected. These were recorded in internal shared spreadsheets and JIRA reports. The transition to folio did bring better functionality and other necessary improvements. For example, during the downtime, an API was written to directly connect ASpace and Kayasoft, the system used by our offsite location. And as we got closer to Kheel and Weill ingests, we conducted a series of trainings where RMC staff went through in detail of the various steps we do for most of our common operations in ASpace. That was a great way to onboard Kheel and Weill colleagues, train newly hired staff here at RMC, generate discussion in common archival practices, and within and beyond ASpace, and invite other stakeholders within the library, such as colleagues from cataloging or the digital preservation units, whose work would benefit by a closer look in the backstage of ASpace. As RMC is now part of a team of repositories, one of the most significant changes in our operations is to be aware of our projects and which ones of those are repository specific and which ones will affect shared fields, in which case the decision need to be made based on input from all constituents. For example, preparing for a second migration of records that somehow were not identified for the initial launch is largely unaffected. But agents cleanup or the creation of top containers and location profiles, these are things that will affect shared content across repositories. And so we need to make decisions based on input from all constituents.
Hi, I'm going to speak a bit about the background of the Kheel Center's implementation of ASpace and the current state of our implementation. The Kheel Center has used for almost 20 years now what we refer to as KIDB, the Kheel Integrated Database, which is a heavily customized and boutique archives management system that was built in an Access database. It was built by a Cornell developer at the previously mentioned Mann Library, but was heavily modified by the previous technical services archivist to meet Keel's specific needs. Back in 2016, when Cornell started first exploring moving into ArchivesSpace as a content management system, the previous technical services archivist was part of those meetings and consultations with the RMC staff to determine at that time if it made sense to move into ArchivesSpace. It was ultimately decided not to move Kheel in at the same time as RMC for a couple of reasons, one of which being the ingest of an entire museum's worth of records when the Kheel Center obtained the materials from the American Textile History Museum. However, once that process was done and RMC had been the successful canary in the coal mine, as it were, Kheel circled back around to implementing ASpace for ourselves. And so in spring of 2021, I started to plan the implementation of ArchivesSpace at the Kheel Center. My first step was to reach out to the project participants for the RMC migration. The former technical services archivist or former assistant technical services archivist at the RMC had, in the years since the implementation, moved to the Kheel Center to, in fact, oversee the collections of the American Textile History Museum. So I had that resource at my fingertips, which was very helpful. Was also able to consult with our former digital archivist and other DevOps team members who oversaw the implementation. After meeting with them and discussing the project with Julia, who has been my partner through this process, we began to meet to both map all of our KidBee fields to the appropriate fields in ArchivesSpace, and to begin the laborious process of exporting and cleaning all of the metadata in KidBee, and also to begin preparing our EADs for cleaning for their import into ASpace. However, we hit a bit of a snag towards the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, when the majority of the participants in the original migration left Cornell for other positions, and that slowed down our work a bit. And one of our strategies to address the sudden lack of project participants was to hire an external consultant to clean the EADs, allowing to clean about our 2,600 EADs, allowing Julia and I and other Cornell Kheel staff members to focus on our accession data and cleaning other metadata. Thankfully, we got new DevOps teams who joined us in late summer, early fall 2022, and our project has started moving forward quickly again after about the 9 months of stalling. Next slide. Our current state of the Kheel implementation is really focused around collaborating with our Cornell colleagues, both to continue to reach out to current workers at RMC who are using ASpace every day, as well as working with my colleague, as I said, who had previously been at RMC. We are taking the manual that Katerina mentioned, that RMC, and we are adding separate documentation in the manual for Kheel specific workflows so that we have a central document, but with specific instructions for the workflows of each repository. We have been setting up joint trainings between RMC, Kheel Center, and Weill Cornell staff members over Zoom, which has allowed us to talk through workflows, discuss how best to use ASpace for our specific needs, and also discuss those places where we have to share specific workflows across our repositories in a single instance. Kheel has also had specific staff trainings where we are both working to familiarize all of our individual archivists and staff members with ASpace, and it has also allowed us to fine-tune how Kheel will be using ASpace based on our previous workflows. In some instances, adjusting our practices to fit in with procedures RMC has already established in the ASpace instance, and in other places, updating or slightly tweaking fields to better suit Kheel's needs. And finally, we have been having meetings between the technical services from Weill, Cornell, RMC, and Kheel to make sure that we are all on the same page and keeping the lines of communication open. Currently, for the Kheel Center, we have our live production front end. It is being used for new sessions into Kheel. We are still using it in parallel with KidB, specifically because we currently need to continue to use KidB to locate and retrieve boxes. Although we are planning to move into Aeon, which will then allow us to fully move out of KidB. We have uploaded the roughly 2,600 cleaned EADs into our test server, and we are doing, we are also currently testing the uploads of our clean to session metadata. We are mapping our container profiles and creating container profiles that have not already been created in the ASpace instance. And finally, we have roughly 900 collections that we refer to as non-EAD collections. Essentially, they're collections that have a decent amount of metadata in our Access database, and that data needs to be also migrated to ASpace out of KidB.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the data considerations that have impacts on the various repository data that are in the various repositories. So first, it's really important to recognize places where metadata is shared across all repositories. And agent and subject records are the most notable place where data is shared. Since RMC was the first repository in ASpace, consideration of existing agent and subject records was not needed because they were the only repository at that time. As part of the migration process for RMC, duplicate records were often created as part of the various import steps. So different agent and subject records were created in the import process for resource records and accession records. For Kheel and Weill, however, more diligence is needed to link to pre-existing records in ASpace and not add more duplicates to the pile. And I'm using air quotes right now, even though you can't see me. This calls for extra steps during migration to compare agents and subjects to pre-existing records in ASpace and link to those existing records during import rather than creating new duplicate sets of records. I'm currently doing this by extracting agent and subject reports via the API, comparing those to my migration data from KidB and OpenRefine, and then linking or creating records from the migration data where it's appropriate. User-defined fields are also an important place where you have to consider the shared data. ASpace allows for a fixed number of user-defined fields in an instance. These fields are shared across repositories and are limited, so collaboration and discussion is needed to make best use of these fields across all repositories. For example, the Kheel Center wanted to bring over their KidB index number from the Access database, and there was no existing ASpace field that really accommodated it. After discussion among the repository members, it was decided that a user-defined field would be best used to contain this data, but we also decided to adapt the field into a field called legacy identifier, which could be used across all repositories as opposed to a field narrowly defined as KidB index number. And it's important to think about how data cleanup projects can affect all repositories. As I mentioned previously, duplicate agents and subjects have been created and will continue to be created as part of the various migration processes. A cleanup reconciliation project for these records will need to happen once all the migrations are completed, and many agent records will need to be merged. Since this will happen across repositories, careful consideration of what individual information is retained or discarded from the duplicate records will need input from everyone affected by these changes. Next slide, please. So metadata mapping is also needed to ensure fields and metadata are being used the same way across repositories, and that one group isn't interpreting the field in a different way than another group. If uniform language is being used to indicate something in a field, you want to make sure that all repositories are using this language in the same way. So for example, date unknown is the language RMC adopted to indicate that a date does not exist in a resource record. You don't want variations of this used across repositories, like dates unknown or just unknown. Using drop-down menus versus free text fields as much as possible can help with this, but it's important to note that this may not be an option with some fields. Upgrade and maintenance work also requires good communication between all instance members. As upgrades, plugins, and migrations are all happening at the same time, you may have multiple constituents using the same test servers. Communication is very important so that one group does not lose their testing work due to the actions of another group. For example, I was testing accession record migration data for Kheel. At the same time, RMC was testing our automated folio integration and development. RMC needed to reset the test server several times throughout this process and was very good about communicating when this was going to happen so that I could finish working on or pull any data I needed from the test server. Multiple test servers may also be needed if you have several projects in development at once. So right now we currently have an additional test server specifically for the Kheel migration in addition to our regular test server. It's also important to sort out early in the process who will perform administrative duties, such as creating user accounts or assigning permissions. Having a specific person or persons designated as the go-to for adding these tasks will help keep things organized. And it's important that your ASpace users know who they are, especially if they might work in a different department or unit. System upgrades also need input from all users. Cornell is currently in the process of upgrading to 3.0, and all users need to review and test their data as part of this process. One repository may have issues that another one doesn't due to the different ways their legacy data is structured. And then finally, with migration concerns, there's never a one-size-fits-all solution for migrations. And it's important to consider that your source data may look very different between repositories. RMC's source data for their migration were MARC records from Voyager. Kheel and Weill source data are coming from different access databases. All of these data is different, and we couldn't just follow the same roadmap for Kheel that RMC took with their migration because of the differences in source data. Some fields can exist in one repository that don't exist in another repository, and there may be metadata that needs to be remediated, possibly for everyone across all repositories, in order to fit more uniformly in ASpace. And finally, different approaches to data migration may be needed for different repositories. When I was looking at the scripts and processes written for the RMC migration, they were helpful, but they ended up looking very different for some of our Kheel migration processes for several reasons. The aforementioned agent linking, the source data being in MARC versus Access, and the data existing in one repository and not another. So an example of that would be deed of gift information, which is being migrated for Kheel as event records. And this source data did not exist for RMC as part of their migration. So groups may make different decisions on what legacy metadata is important to migrate. Next slide, please. So here's a summary of the places where we found joint decisions were necessary and required input from each repository constituent for successful management of the instance. As I mentioned, shared fields and records, specifically for user-defined fields, location and container profiles, agent and subject records, and staff restriction nodes all have required input from Kheel, RMC, and Weill for successful implementation. Training has been shared across member repositories, and joint training has helped identify or work through questions and concerns identified by all three groups. And documentation also requires joint input to ensure that each member isn't deviating from the shared practices established by the other ASpace users.
So definitely the most important lesson learned through the process of building the shared governance is the need for thorough documentation. In addition to all the types of documentation already mentioned by Julia, it is important to keep track of all decisions made, whether they are small or large, and document the reasons behind them. We need to do this both for the integrity of our current work, but also for our future colleagues who may need to refer back to our processes and understand why something was done in a certain way. And similarly, again, can't stress enough the importance of communicating regularly and often. It's super important. It helps keeping each other updated on progress, on sharing questions, sharing problems and finding solutions. We aim for at least a monthly meeting for regular updates, but also jump in impromptu and quick meetings on a specific issue to move things along as needed.
It's also really important to thoroughly investigate the differences in data use between members and recognize what data may be shared, and also documentation of migration work from one migration to another. Even if they look different, you don't want to reinvent the wheel with every migration. So it's important to share that information.
And I'll just mention that you have to expect the unexpected. Things that you take as a matter of course may, in a case of a shared instance, all of a sudden be not a matter of course. For example, one of the things that RMC and Kheel learned is that we referred to two entirely different boxes as Hollingers. In RMC, Hollinger meant a record carton, and in Kheel, Hollinger meant a legal upright document box. So we had to talk through all of the names for our different containers as we were creating and are creating shared container profiles. And my other advice would be, don't be afraid to hit the brakes. In retrospect, it might have been a good idea for the Kheel implementation to pause when we lost the majority of our DevOps support due to job changeover. It certainly would have saved Julia and I a fair amount of stress, as she and I were essentially the two remaining project participants for a couple of months. So sometimes taking a break is in fact the best way to move a project forward.
And finally, make the most of it, relax and enjoy it. Making collective decisions and building this shared sense of community has been a very positive experience for us. So many times meetings started on one subject, and by the end, we all came out of them having answered questions we didn't even know we had. And also having more people thinking through a problem makes the work lighter and more enjoyable.
And making the most of it doesn't necessarily even mean just making the most of it within your institution. One of the resources I found so helpful was the ArchivesSpace Awesome List, which is linked here. If you want to do something in ASpace, chances are someone else may have already done it before, and you can probably find documentation about their projects online. And so I can't stress enough how helpful this was to me, because I didn't feel like I was reinventing the wheel with everything I wanted to do in the migration.
Yes, as Katerina said, many hands make light work. And so finally, in the last 3 minutes, we would like to invite all of you to come and knock on our virtual door, as the Three's Company song says, and ask us any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That's very funny. All right, so I don't know which of the three each of your repositories is, but yeah, if there are any questions, we do have a couple minutes. Please type those questions into the Q&A and we will get to them. But thank you for a great presentation. Again, I'm going to talk really slowly in case anyone is typing their question as we speak. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and say thank you so much to Elizabeth, Katerina, and Julia for that great presentation. I really appreciate it. There were some really helpful tips in there and some really great information. Jessica Stetler says, thanks for the song virus. Yeah, I think we're all going to be singing that in our head. But yeah, thank you for a great presentation. Thank you for being the last presenters of this session. It's been 2 hours. We've already been together, and there's another session that's going to start again in 2 more hours. So I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, so we are coming right at time, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you to all of our presenters in this first session. It's been a great way to kick off the forum. I'm really, really grateful to all of you. Thank you to everyone who joined us. I see that people are starting to log off, so we'll go ahead and wrap up now. We are going to be resuming in 2 hours. So that's going to be 1 p.m. Eastern, which is my time zone, but you can check your local time on the agenda. We'll come back together in 2 hours. If you have not registered for that session of the forum, you do need to be registered separately to get in, but feel free to go ahead and register now, and I'll make sure that you get that connection information. But again, thank you everyone for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. Bye, everybody.